So my view is that we should be careful of the language we use. I don't like this language some people are using about a new Cold War between the United States and China. I think that's a misreading of history.
So I think the word that about Cold War is really obsolete, and absolutely right. You know, we have economic dependence, we have a social dependence, we have a ecological dependence, we have a technology dependence probably as well. And so it doesn't really make sense to decouple or to really to confront. I noticed that you don't really like this the metaphor, you know, Thucydides' trap, that maybe the rising power challenges ruling power, and then you said that, you know, either there's a you know, challenging part of it, there's also fear part of it, but let's not overemphasize that. So that's really an interesting thing. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that. That's really an interesting thing, because really we don't want to get stuck into kind of a deadly confrontation, because after all, we are so much interdependent now.
Basically, as I see it, China does not pose an existential threat or threat to the existence of the United States. China is not trying to take over the United States, and the United States doesn't pose an existential threat to China. We're not trying to take over China. So in that sense, we will compete, but we should limit the fears. It's not as though it's life or death fears. In that sense, going back to Thucydides, we can, the rise in the power of China is something which is likely to continue. There's not much we can do about that. Only China will do something about it, which is how it behaves domestically. But the fear that creates in the United States is something we can do about, which is to not over-exaggerate China, not become overly fearful. Competition is healthy. Frankly, the idea that the Americans will improve some things at home, such as infrastructure, because China is leading the way, let's say on high-speed rail, that can be healthy. But if it becomes fearful or obsessively fearful, it can become destructive. So my view is that we should be careful of the language we use. I don't like this language some people are using about a new Cold War between the United States and China. I think that's a misreading of history. It implies a deeper and more intractable conflict than is really the case. If you look back to the real Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, there was almost no economic interdependence, whereas with US and China, you find just the opposite, $500 billion of trade. If you look back on the real Cold War, there was no social interdependence, whereas today, more than 3 million Chinese come to the United States as tourists and 300,000 as students. And so you have much greater economic interdependence, social interdependence, and the new aspects that I mentioned, ecological interdependence. During the Cold War, we were less worried about climate change or pandemics. So there are reasons for why this increase in globalization and interdependence make us or urge us to be careful about not using metaphors like the Cold War, which were true for a time of history, but not necessarily accurate descriptions of the current period in history.
Joseph, now we also have other professors like we had